Whenever I've had the opportunity to learn about some theological controversy that formed part of church history, I often find myself sympathizing with the person or the group who were found to be wrong. This is especially true for some of those early Christological controversies and debates. Whenever I've had the opportunity to read some of those sources, my first reaction is usually one of surprise at how sophisticated and complex they are, to the point where I find myself admitting that if I was involved in a controversy like that, I could easily have found myself on the wrong side. One of the examples that comes to mind for me is the controversy between Nestorius and St. Cyril and the rest of the church. And I won't bore you with the details, and I probably can't recite them that accurately anyways, but it was something like Nestorius was trying to appease two theological factions under his pastoral care in Constantinople. And so he tried to find some middle ground compromise where he proposed that within Christ there are two hypostatises, hypostati, maybe? Hypostases? Two substances, one divine and one human. In reality, there was one hypostatic union between humanity and divinity, but there are two natures, human and divine. Now, as an average layman, when I consider a controversy like that, usually my initial reaction is almost one of intellectual despair, because if that's how complex and dense our theology can get, and it does a lot, then what are the chances that most of us aren't walking around with all kinds of heretical, muddled ideas floating about in our heads? After all, it's easy to make mistakes, right? In the end, Nestorius was exiled to a desert monastery after serving in the courts of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. And given how easy it is to make intellectual mistakes like that, it's hard not to sympathize with people like Nestorius who were on the losing end of these controversies. So how do we as Christians reconcile the often severe consequences for heretics like Nestorius in the history of the church, sometimes so severe that it meant the death penalty? Well, the first thing to understand is that heresy, especially the kind that goes down in the history books, isn't mere intellectual error. In the case of Nestorius, it involved several bishops and patriarchs gathering for councils to consider the theological controversy, debate about it, and then render a judgment. And they did so with the intention of coming to some agreement about what the truth of the matter is. This is where we get doctrines and dogmas from. And after it's all said and done, those who propose the wrong solution, the heretical one, are given the opportunity to accept the new dogma. And this is what distinguishes people who have simply made an intellectual mistake to those who persist in heresy. In the case of Nestorius, he chose to persist. And it's this audacious, arrogant persistence that is characteristic of heresy and what makes heresy so evil. Heresy at this point becomes a rejection of the truth and of the community of the church. It's the obstinate insistence that you and you alone are right, and that instead of being conformed and reformed to the image of God and his church, you want God and his church to be conformed to your image and your ideas. You've come to the point at which even the smallest presence of humility should be enough to give you the courage to concede that you've made a mistake, but instead you continue to announce your error as if it's the truth, jeopardizing the unity of the church and the spiritual health of those who may be confused by the controversy you've incited. That is what it means to be a heretic, the kind that goes down in the history books. And it's quite serious. It's characterized by a demonic pride that assumes that everything is subject to your superior judgment and will. And that's something that needs a strong correction before it leads you and potentially countless others down the road of ruin. So maybe you can admit that, yeah, that's problematic. But there was a time when heretics faced the death penalty. And there are very few modern Christians who can think of that without a twinge of regret and embarrassment. It's one thing to say that they've lost the plot and they are consumed by pride and error, but does that justify death? I'd want to say a couple things about that. And the first is that the church was rarely, if ever, involved in actually sentencing someone to death. The church was only there through the Inquisition to render a judgment, a theological judgment about whether or not they were a heretic. and it also existed to protect people from false accusations of heresy. It existed in part to prevent episodes like witch hunts, which were much more common among Protestant communities who didn't have this safeguard. The penalty for heresy was determined and performed by secular authorities. The church was again merely there to determine if they were heretical and then invite them to be reconciled to the church. If they refused to do so and persisted in their heresy, then it was up to the secular authorities to decide what to do. So again, was the death penalty justified? And that brings me to the second point I'd want to make. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe fell into chaos, in which various factions took advantage of the lawlessness that ensued. In a situation like that, strongmen emerged to establish whatever authority can simply be asserted, not because anybody asked them to or elected them to, or because they were worthy leaders, just because they were powerful. If you could lead an army or a militia, what's to stop you from taking whatever land, wealth, or power you might want? So, in this case, warlords became the de facto rulers. As you might guess, they were not benevolent rulers. They spent most of their time acquiring more land and wealth and preventing other warlords from taking it away from them. And as you might also guess, that meant they spent a lot of time just fighting and warring. And it took centuries of missionary work and pressure from the church to reform this military class into the aristocracy. They did so first by helping convert them to Christianity, and then by convincing them to use their military might to protect the vulnerable rather than to acquire more wealth and land and power. And we moderns, we might resent the notion of an aristocracy, but a class of people whose main priority is the exemplification of virtue, even if they didn't really live up to it all the time, is way better than a class of people whose main priority is bloodshed. And through this often messy process of realizing their post-Roman identity, Europe eventually ascended out of that chaos into a diversity of societies and ethnicities that were able to work together and seek peaceful coexistence by virtue of their common identity as Christians. This became known as Christendom, and Christianity was the unifying force that gave Europeans, especially ruling Europeans, a reason to consider each other brothers and sisters rather than rivals. That was until Martin Luther started to promote his own novel doctrines, which the church determined were heretical. And instead of accepting that judgment and repenting, he, like all good heretics, persisted and would announce these ideas to anyone who would listen. The result of which was the rupture of the only kind of unity, true unity, that Europe has ever been able to achieve. And newfound reason for that military class to start treating each other like rivals again instead of brothers. And as you might guess, war became far more frequent and far more severe than it had ever been seen before. The French Wars of Religion and the 30 Years' War were a direct result of the Protestant Revolution, and they contributed to bloodshed and casualties on a scale that had been previously unheard of. When you have a civilization and a continent whose instinct for conflict is suppressed by one unifying denominator, that unifying thing is more precious than anything. If weakened, it could mean the violent deaths of tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of people, which means that anyone who attacks it or tries to compromise it is arguably committing the worst crime imaginable. And that's what Luther's ideas accomplished. It threw asunder that unifying cause for unity and fraternal charity among Europe's leaders. And it was never replaced, because you can't replace truth. There is no substitute for truth or God, who is truth, as a unifying force for peace and coexistence among people. Western civilization's history since then has been marked by escalating conflicts that have gotten worse and worse. The relative era of peace that we've enjoyed for the past 60 years or so isn't because we've found that unity or that source of unity that we've always needed. It's because we were so shell-shocked by the first half of the 20th century that we simply couldn't manage to try it again. But now those generations have gone to their rest, and we who have no direct experience of those traumas have forgotten the reasons why we shouldn't fight each other, and now we're flirting dangerously close to that precipice. So yes, heresy as the thing that competes with the only practical source of unity among diverse societies is really serious, And given that record, I can sympathize with why they treated it with the severity that they did. So you might be asking, well, why don't we treat it with the same severity today? Well, the thing that they were defending, Christendom, it no longer exists, so there's no need to use those extreme measures anymore. Most people today are material, if not formal, heretics. But the church's magisterium has always remained a source of truth, even if today's leaders refuse to listen to her. Heresy has overwhelmed the laity. We can still hold out some hope that the clergy will not succumb to that same fate. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to like and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the making of content like this, then please consider joining my online community, The Reinforcements. It's kind of like Patreon, but instead of being beholden to a big tech company, it's a website I built entirely myself, so there's no risk of us being censored or shut down or anything like that. There are hundreds of people who have already signed up, and our mission is to renew and reinforce the church. So if that's you, then come check it out. As an added bonus for certain tiers, I will also send you a gift box from Glory and Shine, which is a Catholic, family-owned and operated company. They make bath and body products. They're actually their beard balm I'm supporting, or I'm sporting right now. I'm not just a spokesperson, I'm actually a customer. So even if you don't join the Reinforcements, maybe check them out anyways. Glory and Shine, they're an amazing company.